Before we begin, I want to tell you about Intimate Judaism's newest project. Tali Rosenbaum and I have just released Intimacy and Sexuality for Emerging Adults, powered by Intimate Judaism, a new 10-part podcast series designed to give young Jewish adults the kind of honest, thoughtful, and Torah-based guidance about relationships, sexuality, and intimacy that too many of them simply aren't getting. We talk about emotional intimacy and vulnerability, dating and physical boundaries, attraction and sexual desire, anatomy and sexual response, consent and communication, pornography, love and marriage, nida and building intimacy within marriage, some of the difficult questions surrounding sexual orientation and Torah, and more. All 10 episodes of Intimacy and Sexuality for Emerging Adults, powered by Intimate Judaism, are available now. Just click on the links in the description of this podcast.
He sketched actually 4 levels of moving from Hester Panim to what he called He'arat Panim, or Nisiat Panim. In other words, the hiddenness of God's face and the full clarity of the divine presence in our lives. And he basically sketched out a spectrum. And he called the period nowadays as neither here nor there. He says God's presence has not fully been restored. Don't make that mistake. And don't assume that this says anything about the future, but we see God's presence in our lives in a way that we could not possibly have 20 years ago.
I'm Scott Kahn, and this is the Orthodox Conundrum. This is the Orthodox Conundrum on JewishCoffeehouse.com. I'm Scott Kahn. Rabbi Norman Lamm was one of the towering figures of modern Orthodoxy in the 20th century. A brilliant rabbi and speaker, a major Jewish thinker, and the longtime president and chancellor of Yeshiva University. But perhaps the most important reason to revisit Rabbi Lamm today is not simply to appreciate what he accomplished, but also to ask what he still has to teach us today. My guest this week is Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Sinensky, Rabbi Lamm's grandson-in-law, and a scholar who has spent years studying his writings and working through his extensive personal archives. And our conversation focuses on an idea that Tzvi argues was central to Rabbi Lamm's worldview, what Rabbi Lamm called passionate moderation. That phrase can sound almost contradictory. We often associate moderation with compromise, caution, or a reluctance to take a strong stand. Rabbi Lamm meant something very different. His moderation demanded the ability to hold multiple values at once, to recognize complexity without sacrificing conviction, and to combine passionate commitment with intellectual and theological humility. That approach feels remarkably relevant right now. We discuss Rabbi Lamm's religious Zionism, his messianic agnosticism, and how that phrase has often been misunderstood. Rabbi Lamm's belief that loving Israel does not mean refusing to criticize it, his warnings about extremism and irresponsible rhetoric, his approach to anti-Semitism and Jewish pride, and his conviction that strong Jewish leadership sometimes requires saying things that your own community decidedly does not want to hear. Underlying all of this is a larger question. What can Rabbi Lamm teach an Orthodox community living in a moment when moderation is often mistaken for weakness? Certainty is confused with faith, and complexity can sometimes seem like a betrayal of principle. Rabbi Lamm believed that it was possible, maybe even necessary, to be passionate without being extreme, confident without being dogmatic, and deeply committed without pretending that every difficult question has a simple answer. Perhaps that vision of passionate moderation is something we need today more than ever. We'll get to that conversation in just a moment. First, read my articles by subscribing to Orthodox Conundrum Commentary on Substack. It's free to join, and you can cancel at any time. If you'd like even more, you can become a member and receive exclusive bonus content with every episode. For members of Orthodox Conundrum Commentary, stick around towards the end of the episode for an exclusive bonus conversation with Rabbi Sinensky. We talk about some of the biggest misconceptions about Rabbi Lamm, what Tzvi discovered while working through hundreds of thousands of pages from Rabbi Lamm's personal archives, a side of Rabbi Lamm that may surprise even people who know his work well, and some fascinating material that has yet to see the light of day. To hear that exclusive discussion and support the podcast, become a member of Orthodox Conundrum Commentary on Substack. The link is in the description of this podcast. Remember to subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Please rate it and write a review. Continue the conversation on Facebook by joining the Orthodox Conundrum discussion group. Finally, the best way to promote your organization, your business, or yourself is to create a high-quality podcast, and JCH Podcast Productions can help you make that happen. Whether you want to learn how to start your own podcast or want to improve the podcast you already produce, we will make it happen. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Sinensky is director of the Lamm Legacy Digital Archive and director of Judaic Studies at Mainline Classical Academy. A member of the inaugural cohort of SAC scholars, he has edited over 50 books. He publishes Reasonable Judaism on Substack and hosts a daily WhatsApp Torah audio series, From the Beginning. The links to both appear in the description of this podcast. Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Sinensky, thank you very much for joining me today on the Orthodox Conundrum podcast.
Pleasure to be back with you, Scott.
For listeners who don't know very much about Rabbi Norman Lamm, your grandfather-in-law, tell us briefly, Tzvi, why should we be talking about him and listening to him in 2026?
Yeah, great question. So Rabbi Lamm is born in 1927 in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, December 19 of that year. He grows up, very interesting. He actually has a modern Orthodox family that comes from a Hasidic background. He learns in Torah V'das, graduates there in 1944. Believe it or not, his rebbeim are not necessarily so supportive of him attending Yeshiva University, but that's exactly what he does. And he basically falls in love with YU. He takes a gap year actually to study. He then is there from 1945, graduates, ultimately chooses to go into the pulpit. He's in the pulpit 25 years, 1951 to 1976. 1976, he's elected president of Yeshiva University, president for 27 years, chancellor for another 10 until his retirement in 2013. Then he passes in 2020. And I think we could talk about all of his institutional accomplishments, his intellectual accomplishments. Those are all obviously significant and relevant. But one of the things I think is so compelling about Rabbi Lamm, and that I hear from so many people who read his sermons, who are just in touch about his just incredible corpus of writings, is that on the one hand, the issues he's writing about are incredibly relevant, right? They're incredibly timely, and yet they're not actually happening in real time. So for example, I recall someone pointed out to me that Rav Yehuda Amital, the former Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Har Etzion, who it turns out was actually very friendly with Rabbi Lamm, had a lot in common. And they were very much in touch. And Rav Amital actually once received a sermon of Rabbi Lamm, and he said, I read the drasha, and I thought it was delivered this week. And then I looked at the date, and I realized that actually had been delivered 40 years previously. And so I've heard that kind of comment from anyone and everyone. And I think what's so powerful about Rabbi Lamm is that it's timely, but because it's not happening in real time, we can kind of separate ourselves. You think about October 7th, you think about so much of what we're struggling with today, anti-Semitism. Right now, it's so hard to take a step back. But what Rabbi Lamm's career allows us to do is to take a step back that's in a way that's incredibly close to where we are today. And I think that's a big piece of why his writings speak directly to us where we stand right now.
I definitely see that when I've looked through the 5-volume series Drashot L'Dorot, which are a selection, I should say, of his sermons given in shuls from, I believe, the 1950s through the 1970s. Those sermons very often deal with very specific political or practical events that were taking place on the ground in the 50s and 60s. And even though you might say, therefore, it has no relevance to us, the events that were taking place may not be relevant, but the message remains timeless.
Yeah, no, 100%. I'll give you just one example. You would think the moon landing, it's not obviously of immediate pertinence, but first of all, we understand what it was. It's relevant enough that, we either, lived through it or living in the aftermath of it. And there are ongoing issues that are obviously relevant to us, if not in the same way. But it's more than that, because he takes the lunar landing and he says, well, now that we've landed on the moon, now the next plan is to conquer Mars, which everyone's talking about already back then in the 60s. And he says, but before we do that, let's ask the question, should we be spending billions and billions and billions of dollars to conquer other places, not on Earth, or should we be spending them on caring for people in need here on earth? And that was, first of all, that was bold. That was, maybe we shouldn't have focused on the moon, and certainly maybe not on Mars, number one. And no one else was talking that way at that time. But number two, obviously, he's taking a very particular issue, and the questions he's raising about our priorities and our values and our spending are obviously incredibly relevant in 2026. So I'm with you.
One of the things, however, that I think I'm missing is that reading those drushot, they're great. And I also understand that to hear Rabbi Lamm as a speaker was, I don't know if unique experience is the right way to describe it, but he was an incredibly powerful speaker. That I know as well. In fact, it was close to 30 years ago, I once heard somebody say that the best drasha he ever heard in his life was Rabbi Lamm speaking under a chuppah for less than 60 seconds. I don't know any more details than that. He just said it was so powerful, packing so much into that less than 60-second speech at a wedding. And reading them, they're great. They're interesting. They're intelligent. They're packed. And I also know that to hear him live must have been a different sort of experience. And we can't have any recordings of these because these were all given on Shabbos and Yontif.
Yeah, no, 100%. Look, I feel the same way. I'll share something personal in this vein, which is that Rabbi Lamm's wife, Mrs. Mindy Lamm, she used to mention both to me and to my wife, to Tova, who's Rabbi Lamm's eldest, Rabbi and Mrs. Lamm's eldest granddaughter, oldest grandchild. She used to mention how that it made her sad that we, meaning his grandchildren-in-law and other people joined kin to the family later, were not around to see him in his prime. In other words, my wife and I learned with him when I were first engaged and married. We learned with him on a weekly basis from 2004 to 2007. Those who know the Uptown campus of Yeshiva University know that to get a parking spot for free in Washington Heights in a YU parking lot was huge as well. So there are a lot of benefits to that beyond the obvious too. But even then, he was getting older. I heard him speak a number of times as a student at YU, and then once I was in the family, and it was powerful, but it wasn't the same. So I'm with you, Scott. There are recordings that are up. We have a handful of good quality ones. His eulogy from Rav Soloveitchik is out there. It's 1993. He's absolutely in his prime. It's incredible, but even then, it's not as electric as just being in the room.
You actually mentioned in a very recent article you wrote about Rabbi Lamm's stance on homosexuality. I was just reading it before we went on the air, that he spoke, I think it was in 2005, which was almost looking back at something he'd written about 30 years earlier and talking about its applications. He didn't change much in terms of what he said, but you said in writing about it, it's very difficult for you to listen to because having heard what he was like in his prime, and you mentioned his wife and what she had said about her grandchildren-in-law not being able to hear him in his prime. He says very difficult for you to listen to some of these later recordings when he just wasn't the same as he had been earlier.
Yeah, 100%. I was in the Kolel Elyon, in the kind of higher Kolel, after Smicha, after rabbinical ordination at YU, at the same time that I was already marrying and married to his granddaughter. And so I had the opportunity to, interact with him, but he also spoke a couple of times. We had these lunches that were organized that were, every other week, every third week, whatever it was, with a variety of speakers. And on a couple of occasions, Rabbi Lamm addressed us as well. He actually spoke to us on one occasion. I recall, I think it was as late as 2008, or maybe 2007, whatever it was, right around there. And he was actually talking about how we might deal with various challenges in terms of women's issues in the pulpit or in education, and kind of walking us through some of his past experience and how much things have changed, and challenging us to think proactively about these issues. And it was powerful. It was compelling, but it was hard. It was late. He wasn't, it was hard. And it's one thing, people talk about this with various gedolim, at various points in their career, but when you get to know someone personally and it's family, and you're sitting there as a Kolel member and you can't say anything and you can't do anything, it's hard.
Now, you mentioned Rav Amital, and you said in many ways they were similar. And when you said that, I thought about one of the ideas that seems central to Rabbi Lamm's worldview which is something you've called passionate moderation. Now,
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a good way of describing Rav Amital, but I would think it probably is. And in describing Rabbi Lamm like that, in some ways, we don't think of Rabbi Lamm as being passionately moderate. We think of him in terms of Torah Umada. But you argue that this passionate moderation really was absolutely central to his worldview. So can you explain what that means? What is passionate moderation to you, or more specifically to Rabbi Lamm, I suppose?
Yeah.
And what is the difference between passionate moderation and just being in the middle of the road or a centrist?
Yeah, such a good question. He struggled with this himself. At one point, in the 1980s, so as I mentioned, he becomes president in 1976. He then is basically thrown into the whirlwind of a financial crisis. YU turns out is in tens of millions of dollars of debt. His first couple of years are just a big blur. It's like it's like having a newborn baby. He used to say, and so he emerges from that and then finally kind of looks around. Okay, what are the kind of the larger issues on campus now that we've dealt with the existential piece of it? And one of the things that he tackles is, of course, Torah Umada, but he also starts to turn around and he sees what he considers to be a rising extremism in the Jewish community, in the Orthodox community. And then, of course, by the time we get to 1995, you have what many thought at the time was kind of the height of that, namely, of course, the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin. And so he doesn't just talk about Torah Umada then, he talks about this issue of passionate moderation. And one of the things he does is he actually tries to coin a new term. Not a brand new term, but he says people are confusing modern orthodoxy. They don't know what that is. They think it's a lukewarm, commitment to orthodoxy. It's kind of like a midpoint. There's, non-orthodoxy here, and there's Haredi orthodoxy here, and we're kind of like stuck in the middle. We keep Shabbos, but like not that much, these sorts of things. And so he says, okay, let's try sensuous orthodoxy because that's a real, that doesn't have the brand problems of mono-orthodoxy, but of course. Then what happened is everyone said exactly your question. They said, oh, so you're just kind of middling. You're just kind of in between. So he said, it was a waste of time. I just trying to rebrand. I actually haven't tried anything substantial to change. So he went back to modern orthodoxy and gave up.
Oh, he went back to it, actually. I didn't know that.
He went back. Yeah, it's not so widely known. He didn't love modern orthodoxy either. He's got a drasha.
As a term.
As a term, correct. Thank you for clarifying that. Yeah, no, of course, the community was beloved to him and so on and so forth. But yeah, as a term in is early, I think it's the 1960s. He has a sermon, maybe it's early 70s. I don't recall for sure, but basically the sermon is about why he doesn't like the term modern orthodoxy. And he says it's kind of got this, not just this association, but this kind of cravenness to it, where it's, if it's modern, then of course it's going to be good. Nonsense. That's not traditional Judaism. He quotes a thinker by the name of Jacques Maritain, who coined this term chronolatry. Chronolatry, right? So the worship of that which is chronos, that which is new, right? And he says that's not who we are, but that's who people think we are because of we'll call it mono-orthodoxy. So he didn't love any of these. Anyhow, so there's a lot more to say about that, but. He on this issue, so there are two pieces that were essential to him on the substantive issue, leaving aside the name changes and all that, and what it means to be moderate but still impassioned. It's passionate moderation, which is the term that he used. So the first one is he said it's not about finding the midpoint. It's actually about being passionate about multiple things at the same time. He was very uncomfortable with any version of Judaism or of any ideology or religion that placed only one value at the center exclusively. So he points to the Rambam, he points to Rav Sadia Gaon, and I think I didn't hear him specifically address this in context of modern Jewish movements, but I think the idea, for example, that a community would put exclusively Torah study exclusively at the center, I think, if I understand correctly, that would be something deeply problematic for him. There's something beautiful about that, but as an exclusive value, it's a corruption of Judaism. And another thing as well, tikkun olam, right? So fixing the world, that also very popular, very in. You're going to reduce Judaism to just that one value, and that's not authentic either. And of course, the love of Israel, right? So he would say, it's beloved, it's holy, it's special, but it cannot be the be all and end all in itself. And so that, didn't matter whether it was critiquing his own or other communities or whatever it might be. So that's number one, is that multiple values need to be held in conversation, not even in balance, but in conversation with one another. That's one, or else you end up with extremism. The second,
I like to say that you end up with idolatry, but perhaps I'm an extremist in that way. When you
Wait,
take one idea and you put it above all others, I call it idolatry. You're calling it extremism, but I suppose we're saying the same thing in different words.
See, these days, as you say, extremism isn't quite necessarily a dirty word like it was a couple of decades ago. So maybe idolatry would be we should try a rebrand. See if we end up back.
It didn't work for Rabbi Lamm, so I'm not sure it will work for us.
Yeah, no, it's recommended, but it's good to learn from history sometimes. But he did use the term, and this was sharp for a Zionist, for a religious Zionist who's very proud of his religious, Zionist commitment, and certainly had all the credentials in the world. But he actually used the term Israelolatry. Israelolatry. Okay, try that one on for size. I can't imagine that went over well. and he said, it was obviously it was contextual, but he was, was in the wake of actually the Yom Kippur War, and he was saying how we have to be mindful that, this is part of a larger vision for Avodat Hashem, for a connection to God, and, et cetera. But it's not just about sanctifying the land without, reference to values. But I want to add as well, the second piece of the passionate moderation, Scott, is that not just in terms of what we hold as values, but also how we express those values. And that was a key piece.
What do you mean?
So I'll give you an example. He has a sermon back from 1966. It's called Sweet, Sour, or Salty. It's Parsha Vayikra, which doesn't seem to have anything to do with anything that we're talking about, right? And that's kind of his point. Also, he's a rabbi. He needs a sermon. It's Parsha Vayikra. Oh my gosh, Karbanos again. I can't talk about, the Rambam and the Ramban, whether Karbanos or reconciliation ideal again. Not that he did that, but you get the idea, right? It's the same divrei Torah that cycle through, Ish Asher Yecheta, right? The leader, Anasi Asher Yecheta, leader, right? There's like certain classic divrei Torah that, at a certain point, hopefully you get a little bit more creative. If you've ever given those, Scott, I don't need to call you out on that. I know I have. Anyhow, he quotes whatever it is, but he uses the need for salt and various things that we use to flavor the sacrifices. And basically the idea that he develops is that I think it's based on a comment of the Ktav HaKabbalah, Rav Yaakov Tzvi Mecklenburg, is essentially that we need sweet and we need sour and salted. We need different kinds of flavorings. And he says basically these represent different kinds of ways that we represent ourselves both to God and to others as well. And it's kind of his point there in the sermon is that it's not enough to be balanced, to have these different flavors, but it's also important to be balanced in terms of how we, represent ourselves. So he says there are certain things we have to be passionate about, and we can't be compromising, intermarriage or other things. He says, it's wrong. We have to be forthright. Obviously, you deal with it in the real world, etc. But we have to be firm in terms of our values. But that doesn't mean, even if we're 100% clear-cut in what we stand for, it doesn't mean we need to hit other people over the head in a counterproductive sort of way. And so you spoke, for example, about kfiyah dati. It's about not coercing people to be religiously observant. He said it's the machloket, the debate here about whether to legislate about certain things, in Israel or otherwise, or not, is not about how committed we are to our religious practice. It's about whether we think that we're most likely to empower and inspire others to embrace these religious practices that we hold so dear through a heavy-handed way or through a more attractive, engaging, frankly, respectful way.
Right. Whether it's effective or not is the gauge.
That's exactly right. And if we really love our religion, he might say, then what we need to do is to make sure that we, like Avraham Avinu, are representing it in an inspiring, uplifting sort of way. So it was really both of these things. It was both the, being able to hold more than one, as what you call idolatry, what he called extremism, and it's also the ability to represent Judaism in panim shochakot, as the Midrash in Bialik put it, in a smiling, attractive sort of way.
I think part of the problem is, and I find this myself because I often cite Rabbi Lamm's term messianic agnosticism, which means, as he says explicitly, it's not that we question whether the Mashiach will come. Of course, Mashiach will come. The question is whether the modern state of Israel is, as it often is defined, the beginning of redemption, whatever that phrase means. It's not a question of not believing in the 12th principle of the Rambam. It's a question of identifying a specific historical phenomenon with that principle as if they are synonymous. And that, he said, is really a problem. I'm in Israel, and I find that this is a constant problem. I find not that it's a problem that people might say, yes, we believe strongly that this is the beginning of the redemption. Fine, that's okay. One can certainly say that, and one has a lot of reasons to believe that that's true. The problem is when people determine something absolutely as if it itself is one of the principles of faith. And they also reject anyone who says otherwise, as if they're simply not passionate enough, not believing enough, perhaps don't have enough emunah. That's when the problem comes in, as I see it.
Yeah, 100%. I had this experience. Certainly, this happened to Rabbi Lamm. There's no question about that during his time. It happened to Soloveitchik as well. I mean, the Rav, I don't want to say that Rabbi Lamm inherited this from him because he was a very independent thinker, but he was very much similar to his Rebbe, to Rav Soloveitchik in this respect, in terms of a passionate embrace of religious Zionism, but not one that was that wanted, again, that was messianic in the way that you just described it, Scott. But I've seen it actually with one of my own Rebbeim. Rabbi Lamm I consider, of course, one of those, but another one, reluctance from Gush. And the irony here is that I have seen it recently from frankly, from reluctance students who made Aliyah or stated, either stayed in Israel or Israeli students, who then have described what I think is, frankly, an accurate portrayal of his approach to messianism and his approach to understanding what we can and cannot say with confidence about the Yad Hashem, the hand of God in history right here and right now, then saying, well, apparently, if that's what you think Reluctance believe, that we cannot assume that, that certain events in the war against Gaza or against Iran or whatever it might be, we need to read that in the map in a particular kind of way, that if you don't say that, then how could you say Hallel on Yom HaAtzmaut? I actually heard that argument. And that to me is very perplexing. I think that represents exactly the mindset, Scott, that you're describing. In other words, wait a second, hold on. There's a jump from how can you hold that, it was someone actually went through it, how can you say Hallel on Yom HaAtzmaut, and how can you celebrate the founding of the state of Israel? And I said, wait a second. It's possible to say that and it's possible to go further. It's possible to say, I believe that the hand of God is present in history and the large-scale events, the founding of 1948, that it is redemptive, if not messianic, but it's redemptive and it is miraculous, of course, extraordinarily so, or 1967, right? Six-Day War. To say that is miraculous, we should say Hallel and so on and so forth. But to draw a line from once you say that, then I need to read contemporary events in a very narrow, specific theological way. I think it's sloppy logic, but I think it says a lot about us as a community in terms of the conflation of those two.
I would agree, particularly because it seems actually a betrayal of traditional Judaism, even though very few people would think of it that way, that all of a sudden, if something is not messianic, somehow it's nothing. And this idea that people live for 2,000 years looking at events, hopefully seeing the presence of the divine presence, the Shekhinah, and the actions of God through history, whether they were actions that were good for us or not necessarily, but the idea is that God was always present. And suddenly, with the advent of the State of Israel, and in particular after the Six-Day War and the 1973 War, Yom Kippur War, that somehow if it's not messianic, therefore it's not worth thanking God for it because it doesn't even exist, has nothing to do with God. That seems to me to be a betrayal of the idea of Hashgacha Pratit, to say that the only Hashgacha Pratit I care about is messianic Hashgacha Pratit.
Right. I want to push back a little bit, not in disagreement with what you're saying theologically. I actually agree with it fully. But what I want to say in terms of, I just want to credit those, and not paint kind of like a simplistic picture here. Not that you are, but just.
I certainly am, because I'm doing it for the sake of argument. Absolutely. I'm painting with a very broad brush. I acknowledge that.
We're on a podcast, obviously. What am I thinking here?
I often tell people a podcast is not a course. It is not a university course. It's not even a class. It is a hopefully educational piece of entertainment.
We call that edutainment where I come from, indeed. So I won't tell you whether that was coined positively or negatively, Scott. But that's also me just trying to drive up your numbers. There you go. Anyhow, so
I'm all for that.
Yeah, there you go. So anyhow, but like in fairness, let's just say even those who believe that we are in a messianic period have of course called this Reshit Smichat Gulateno. It's Reshit's, right? Rav Herzog who insisted upon including those words in the Tefillah Shalom Hamdina, right? It just wasn't that, right? They based on the Yerushalmi many. Yerushalmi says Kima, right? It's a little bit at a time, like Alota Shachar, like the dawn, and so on and so forth. And there is across the board very much recognition that there are stages. The question is, where are we in that process, and how are we in that process of right a more immediate lead up to the Geula? And in fairness as well, you have these suggestions from going back to the Vilna Gaon. You do have a theological basis there, right? You do have Kol HaTor. You do have this from people during the period of the Holocaust. Rabbi Chanan Wasserman, not exactly card-carrying Zionist, but nonetheless. Rabbi Lamm, since we're here talking about him as well, he was very close with the author of the Torah, with Torah Shlema, from Nachum Mendel Kasher. Also wrote a book about Atzchalta de Geula. So, it's more subtle in other areas as well. But where I agree with you is that, or Rabbi Lamm would have agreed with you, is that we don't know. And he was very careful about this. You called it agnostic. That's exactly right. But that can be, I think it's important to kind of speak. We don't know. He was very clear on this, right? It could.
In fact,
well
I've seen in one of the essays that I
Messianic
constantly cite, he said, it's not that I'm denying it. I'm not denying the messianic character of the state. He said, I just don't know.
Right, that's correct. And of course, he was misunderstood in this regard as well. And people said, people claim that he didn't believe in the Mashiach, but he, obviously did, as you say. But they also said that you insist this is not messianic. And you said, no, my point is we need to be, it's humility. It's theological humility. It's that we don't know God's plan. We don't have Nevi'im anymore. And our job is not to over-ascribe to a spiritual reality that we no longer have access to and knowledge of, but instead to accept that reality for what it is without superimposing any assumptions, and to act in accordance with the will of God, as best we can.
And I'm fully in agreement with what you just said. It's not that I would ever say to anybody that we should have only the old Rav Reiner style religious Zionism, or perhaps Rav Soloveitchik style religious Zionism, which was pre-Gush Emunim. I think Gush Emunim is very important. We have to really see what they've added to, maybe in this case, real passion, perhaps sometimes veering into extremism. I just lament the fact that that has often become, at least in the political arena and sometimes otherwise, the only strain of religious Zionism that seems to matter often. I think it would be much better if we had a big tent that would have religious Zionism include various strands, the messianic and the non-messianic varieties together, and let God work out which one is correct in the long term. That's how I see it.
Interesting. Yeah. It reminds me of a letter that I discovered one day. Go back to Rav Amital. This is an amazing find. I sent it immediately to people over at Har Etzion at Gush. It was after, so Rav Amital founded the Meimad Party, as you know, and I believe he founded in 1988 or thereabouts, right? So it's this, it's often described as a dovish, right, a religious Zionist, a political party. And he doesn't get any mandates in the first election in '88, and you can imagine that's pretty disappointing. Ultimately he does join in the government later on, but that's only after the Rabin's assassination in 1995. And Rabbi Lamm, who apparently had already, as I say, become friendly with him, wrote an absolutely exquisite rabbinic language letter to Rav Amital. It's a letter of nechama in rabbinic Hebrew, consolation, and he talks about how disappointing this must be for Rav Amital, and yet that by refusing to accept the majority rule as the determination for how we determine our values, he said Rav Amital has brought a spirit of, and brought to the forefront a spirit of, moderation and of emphasizing ahavat chinam, right? Love, free love, for no other reason than this is my fellow Jew, and so on and so forth. It's absolutely exquisite. It's up on the website, but it's very much about this. It's very much not that I think Rav Amital, this should have been the only voice, but I think we've really lost something. And yet, by putting this out front and center, you have really brought something important for us to consider as a community. That they connected on that as well.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about his religious Zionism. What did Rabbi Lamm, aside from seeing it as we don't know if it's messianic, what did he see the state of Israel as functioning? Meaning, what was its purpose in his Weltanschauung and his Hashkafat Olam? How did he understand the state of Israel from a religious Zionist perspective?
Yeah, so significant. So there are a couple of pieces here. I mean, he emphasized heavily, similar to Rav Soloveitchik and Kol Dodi Dofek, that if it were just to save Jewish lives alone, Dayenu, that would have been enough. That obviously was not the entirety, not even close to the entirety of his religious Zionism, but absolutely that was the case. He believed that this was incredibly important for opportunities to also not just to save Jewish lives, but to restore the dignity of the Jewish people after the Shoah. Any suggestion that there's any direct connection theologically between the Holocaust and the founding of the State of Israel was an anathema to him, as it was for Rav Soloveitchik, no question about that. But nonetheless, the idea that the tragedies of the Shoah were an immense chilul Hashem, or desecration of the name of God at the very highest of levels, and that 3 years later we had this miraculous gift from God of Medinat Yisrael, of the state of Israel, that to him was a tremendous kiddush Hashem that, again, does not in no way counterbalances any of the tragedies of the Shoah, but should be recognized as adding that as well. But in addition to all of that, he went much further. I won't kind of mention every single dimension of his religious Zionism, but I will say this. He really, he's often misunderstood in this respect. He is often cited as religious Zionism is presented as being, as you say, non-messianic, or more accurately, agnostic as to the messianism. But he did not stop there, Scott. And this is what's completely missed. And he actually drew a line in this way, not again in terms of causation, but to the Shoah as well. Because when it came to his understanding of the Holocaust, he said two basic things. Number one, we cannot possibly explain any of this. There is no mipnei chata'enu golinu mi'artzinu here. This is not that. There are other views in Chazal, other views in Gemara already. There are different perspectives. If you read the book of Job, there are other perspectives out there. He said that's number one, that we cannot, in good conscience, we're not Nevi'im, it's the same thing, right? We cannot, explain God's purposes, especially in the wake of such a horrific tragedy. And so number one, that was the first piece of the Holocaust theology. But number two is he also emphasized, Scott, the importance of the Shoah as a period of intense hester panim. In other words, he took the pasuk in Ha'azino and he developed it, of course, based on Chazal, etc., into a larger description of the disconnect between Klal Yisrael and God during the depths of tragedy. And then he sketches in a major address called The Face of God, which is really about the Holocaust, delivered at Stern College in 1986. He sketched actually 4 levels of moving from hester panim to what he called he'arat panim, or nisiat panim. In other words, the hiddenness of God's face and the full clarity of the divine presence in our lives. And he basically sketched out a spectrum. And he called the period nowadays as neither here nor there. It's the title of one of his sermons delivered in 1968, appropriately shortly after the Six-Day War. What do we make of all this? He says God's presence has not fully been restored. Don't make that mistake. And don't assume that this says anything about the future, but we see God's presence in our lives in a way that we could not possibly have 20 years ago. And so Rabbi Lamm develops this idea that the state of Israel is an opportunity for us to be connected to God in a qualitatively different sort of way through our not just performance of the mitzvot, but through our connection to God, through the spirituality of the land, through the mitzvot of the land, and so on and so forth. And so for him, it was an avenue. It was a crucial avenue for us to restore and to enhance our connection with HaKadosh Baruch Hu.
Did he ever consider moving to Israel? Was that something which was part of his worldview at all?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. In 2 respects, I'll tell you the boring part first, Scott, and then hopefully keep people on the podcast. Right, he would actually talk regularly about Aliyah. He encouraged his congregants specifically, every family, their goal should be, if it works out, for everyone should seriously consider it. And he said, well, we can't obviously tell our children what to do. He said it should be our aspiration as a community for at least one child of every family to choose to make Aliyah. And he preached this publicly from 100%. He even said at one point, this is really interesting because at that point, none of his children had made Aliyah. He said, one of my children is making Aliyah, and so too, I say I practice what I preach, and hopefully others will emphasize that as well. And I always joke around with my mother-in-law and with her siblings that, which one was it? None of you are in Israel yet. Who's planning to make Aliyah at that time? So I don't know. But now he's got there as well himself. So he spoke about Aliyah quite regularly, quite openly, and really encouraged it. But yeah, there were a couple of times. Here's the most interesting part is I actually thought about it seriously. So he got a number of offers to move to Israel. Many of them he didn't take overly seriously. One of them is he was offered to become the chief rabbi of Haifa. I think this was 1971. I actually found a great nugget recently, Scott. This is when he grew his beard. Some would say a goatee. If you look at all the pictures of him in his rabbinate, he doesn't have a beard. But then, for example, 1976, at his when he's elected president, so you look at all the pictures, now then you have a lot of them. He has a beard. What happened? So I just found that he wrote that when he was being considered for chief rabbi of Haifa, I said, there's no such thing as a Rav here in Israel without a beard. So I grew a beard. That was the one thing that came of all that.
Okay.
That's actually what he said.
That's funny.
Reminds me actually of a great story of Rabbi Riskin, who's a Rav here and does not have a beard, actually has, I think in his book of his collection, I forget the name of the book, but he's got the 100 stories. He's a collection of stories for my grandchildren.
Sure.
Is that what it is? Yeah.
I have it on my shelf over here.
Yeah, okay, there you go. So you can check it out. I believe it's in there. He tells the story about when he was being considered for chief rabbi of Efrat, and he didn't grow a beard, and they asked him, how could it's pasmished? How could he be a chief rabbi of a city in Israel without a beard? He said, I gave them the answer the only answer that they could accept. He said, Mishum Shalom Bayis. My wife will not let me grow a beard. That's why I don't have one. He said, that's how I got the job. Anyhow, so Rabbi Lamm was considered chief rabbi of Haifa, I think in 71. He was offered to become the president of the Technion, actually, at one point. I found this as well. But the most serious one...
And that was a different offer, because that's also in Haifa.
That's also in Haifa. Yes, that's true. It was a different offer. That's correct. I don't know. That's because I didn't actually think to put those together. It's a good point. But I don't know if it was the same year or not. I have to check back. I'm not certain. He was offered to become chief rabbi of the United Kingdom and also president of Jews College there in London as well. And some other things too. But one of the most interesting ones, the one that he seriously considered, was to become president of Bar-Ilan University, which he was courted for from as early as 1970 until 1973, when he ultimately declined the position. Which worked out well in that he had no guarantees of becoming president of YU at the time, but it ended up working out just a few short years later. But that I knew coming in. But when I was going through the archives and was going through his materials, I found a couple of things. I found a contract. Ludwig Jesselson, I believe, was the chairman of the board at that time. There's a contract at Bar-Ilan, right? And there's a full contract and an addendum to his contract. His salary was there. His let's just say he wouldn't have been hitting finding oil in the desert. Let's just in the Middle East.
But negotiations really had progressed. It wasn't just some pie in the sky idea that no one took seriously. There was actually a contract there.
There was a contract that was waiting to be signed. They went for a sabbatical, mini sabbatical in 1970, 1971, where they spent 4 months. They didn't tell this to anyone, but it turns out he actually wrote this explicitly in one of his memories that I found. That was in large part to check things out, see if it could work for the family. So that's relatively early. It's a few years earlier. And the best part, Scott, is that he had a house. They had a house in Ramat Chen, just not far from Bar-Ilan. The board apparently at Bar-Ilan had suggested 2 places. There was one they looked at, didn't like. There was another one that they liked. Mrs. Lamm approved.
They actually bought a house there.
They did not buy the house, I don't believe. It was either owned, I think it was owned by Bar Ilan or someone, and they had chosen it so that would become, maybe it would have been university owned. I'm not sure exactly how it had been structured, but they had selected a house that they would purchase and they would live in. He had a contract, and last second, he ended up declining it for two major reasons. Number one, actually the negotiations were reopened after they had agreed to terms orally.
Oh, interesting.
And that spooked him a little bit. Number one. And number two, a lot of the faculty didn't really want a university president who would actually run the academics of the academic side of the university. They just wanted a fundraiser. And there was a lot of back and forth about that issue. I think ultimately he felt that he didn't have the confidence that he would be empowered to actually oversee the learning side of the institution. He said, this is not what I want to do here. So he passed on it. But yeah, that's Aliyah was, I mean, they were, ABA, all but Aliyah.
Wow, interesting. Now, let me ask you about his idea behind criticism of Israel. That's something which comes up often now with people who care deeply about Israel and who may even acknowledge that Israel sometimes does things that are not correct, which is true of any state. Perhaps not a fully messianic state, but in an era which is, let's say, at least pre-messianic, every state, by virtue of being a state, is not going to be perfect. And some people say that any criticism of Israel, and they mean this out of the goodness of their hearts, it can only cause problems, meaning we have to keep it entirely in-house. People in a social media world who do not have Israel's best interests at heart will then take what we say about Israel, which is meant to be constructive criticism, and use it as destructive criticism, as a way to undermine the legitimacy of the state altogether. And therefore, some people will say this is not the time to engage in criticism publicly that can be taken by others who are anti-Semitic. What was Rabbi Lamm's opinion when it came to criticizing the state of Israel when it did something he did not think was right?
Yes, that's a great question. And I want to answer it in two parts. And I want to start by partly acknowledging and agreeing to, in a limited way, to what you just represented as a certain viewpoint about not criticizing publicly. And then I want to come to his more robust full position. So he said, it's very interesting. He was willing to be critical of Israel throughout his career. I'll come back to that in a moment. Publicly, very publicly. But what's interesting is that if you take a look after the Yom Kippur War, his sermons change. He's not critical, and he was critical of Israel regularly before that point, quite regularly. I'll explain how. But it's very interesting. After there was a moment of this shock, of this devastation, what he compared to, what he called actually Israel's Vietnam. That was how he referred to the Yom Kippur War. He spent time there afterward, etc. He did not say, to the best of my knowledge, a single critical word, certainly not from the recorded sermons from the pulpit, for a full year until actually Yom Kippur 1974. Then he delivered a drasha where that was part of his point, is that we need to, it's called diffidence and indifference, where we need to strike a balance between having humility on the one hand and having self-confidence on the other. And he related it to some of the challenges Israel was undergoing, and he was critical. And what I take from that, and also when he became president, it was less, especially during the early years. He was less critical of Israel, though he was at times. What I take from that is that Rabbi Lamm would acknowledge that there are certain moments in time when we need to be particularly careful. And not just because of the way that the message might be misconstrued klape chutz outwardly, but also because it might be a counterproductive moment when our love for Israel and for family dictates that this is just not the right time. There are certain moments in our communal experience, it doesn't have to be October 8th, but we all get that there are just certain moments when it's not the time for certain messages. So I want to acknowledge that Rabbi Lamm's own career seems to bear that point out. At the same time, 1 year after the Yom Kippur War, he did speak out, and he certainly would not agree that that is an indefinite sort of thing. Now, obviously, he wasn't operating in the world of social media, but nonetheless, Jew hatred, Israel hatred was alive and well. I mean, right? You don't have to. This is, of course, in Kol Chadash Tachat Hashamesh. It's and he got some really fun anti-Semitic letters. Maybe for another time, if we have time, I can talk you through. I just did one about back in 1953. Was a lot of Christian anti-Semitism letters he got. Hitler was right. You should go join Stalin. He'd be better company for you. And so on and so forth. These sorts of things. Go study the 10 Commandments and focus on earning a pretty penny. That's because that's what you Jews do. So he saw all of this in his lifetime. But although he didn't have social media the way we have it, but certainly he saw the criticism, and he nonetheless was willing to be outspoken. And he actually addressed this explicitly in a 1971 sermon. Let criticism be welcome. You can see he lays it out there. Let criticism be welcome. And he basically says that if we are going to create an environment where our fellow Jews in all directions cannot offer constructive criticism because we confuse that with illegitimate criticism, he says we will not be able to get where we need to get as a people. Says if parents do that to their children, then they're not going to be able to grow up to be the kinds of people that they need to be. It needs to be moderated. It needs to be done with wisdom, but it absolutely if we really care about one another, we need to be willing to not just deliver criticism, but more than that, to be able to consider the criticism and not to be defensive and to assume it comes from a negative place, but to be done b'chafsavot. Doesn't mean it's right, but I'm going to judge favorably that this is coming out of love. And Scott, he did it, and he lived by what he preached. He, in particular, he did not have the fondest view of David Ben Gurion.
I was about to ask what were some of his criticisms, so now you're getting into that.
Oh my gosh, this is not so much of Israel, but this is, of course, of the representative Israel, and is partly a criticism of Israel, but he did not like Ben Gurion at all. It's very interesting living in 2026 when you have a certain image of the Herzls of the world and the Ben Gurions of the world and the Begins of the world, right? But they were real people.
The founding fathers, so to speak.
And right, exactly. Yeah, I'll tell you something else. Rav Soloveitchik didn't like Ben Gurion at all. I have seen, it's online, there's a letter where I don't know if I would have put up this letter or what the story was behind it, but it's available. And the Rav speaks very, very, very negatively about Ben Gurion's, he actually calls it Jew hatred. Ben Gurion was virulently anti-religious for all the Bible study sessions that he held, virulently anti-religious, and he also would call out the Golah, Shlilat HaGolah, kind of minimizing and kind of being dismissive of any Jewish community that exists now or will exist.
Israelatry, as you said before.
He would have been offended to have someone say that he worshipped any god of any sort. I think
that's true, I suppose.
Rabbi Lamm called him out, I would say, at least 10 times in Drasho over the course of his career. And there was one time he went on vacation and he went to visit. He did a diplomatic visit in a Buddhist temple.
Ben Gurion or Rabbi?
Ben Gurion. No, not Rabbi Lamm. Ben Gurion, or not the Rav either. And he, right. No, good to be clear on that. And Rabbi Lamm delivers a sermon about it. He says, the guy's gone to more monasteries than he's gone to Batei Knesset, than he's gone to shuls. You don't have to be a religious man, but, the entire ethos of the labor movement at that time, and we've come, thank God, so far in this respect in Israel today. But yeah, so he called out Ben Gurion about 10 to maybe even a dozen times in his sermons, and it was part of a larger critique until really 1973, I would say, of the, basically until Begin was elected effectively. It was, this criticism of the old school labor Zionists as being anti-religious, and that, and so he spoke about that all the time. That's just one example. There were others as well.
Did he have any criticisms from the other side about Jewish power, for example?
Yeah, 100%. That came a little bit later, right? Because the politics changed, right? And so as, he was very involved in the Mizrahi movement. He was very dedicated to the Mizrahi movement. And in the 1980s, it's very interesting, so long as the Mizrahi, in the earlier years, Mizrahi did not associate with a particular side of the Israeli religious spectrum. They were willing to partner with pretty much anyone, and so they sat in governments with the left, with the center. There wasn't really so much of the center, but the left and to the right, no problem. But in the 1980s, they started to lose some of their steam. Some of the positions that they held were now becoming mainstreamed, and therefore, ironically, they had less religious clout, and also some of the old school, what you would call the Revreinist Zionists, who were the founders, the Zerach Warhaftigs of the world, and others, Yosef Berg, who was a very moderate person and a dear friend of Rabbi Lamm. As they phased out, there was a new generation I would say, more right-leaning, starting in the 80s. 80th anniversary of Mizrahi is celebrated. Rabbi Lamm gives a keynote address, and he basically says we need to refocus on not being political, not associating ourselves with with the right any more than the left, and we need to focus on the core mission of religious Zionism, which is education, which is Torah u'mitzvot, which is bringing that not just to ourselves and our own communities, but to the wider Israeli community, the wider Jewish community, a chibat zion, a love of Israel, and not to become aligned with a particular political party. And then, forget that, the 1990s, as I mentioned, Rabin, and before that, the Baruch Goldstein massacre in Hebron. Goldstein was a graduate of Yeshiva University schools. He went to Einstein, the Albert Einstein College of Medicine. It was devastating for Rabbi Lamm to see that these, he called them weeds that grew in our own garden, had started to sprout. He was take a look, Scott, and any readers, if you read one thing just from today, take a look at his eulogies for Yitzhak Rabin. Again, as Rav Amital said, it could have been written today. It talks about the way that extremism can cause people across our community to explode and and that we need to take responsibility for our rhetoric. Let it never again be said that a prime minister of the state of Israel is a rodef, is pursuing other Jews to kill them, and therefore is deserving of being killed. You think it's a coincidence that someone in our own community, he said, who went to Keren B'Yavneh, went to Yeshiva there, then went and assassinated the prime minister? Words have consequences. So if we want to say that words have consequences today, Scott, when our enemies use those words, we want to say, I'm here, not, that grew up in North Jersey, right? I have many friends that are in New York. If we want to tell Mamdani that words have consequences, lahavdil, I'm not equating at all between someone like that and our challenges, but we need to acknowledge that internally, we need to take responsibility for the fact that our own words have consequences as well. And he was very outspoken about that on the right as well.
And one of the lines of his, maybe the line I have cited the most over the past few years, is exactly that line about the weeds in Baruch Goldstein. He said, if I recall correctly, he said, people will say, there are weeds in our garden. But he goes, no, but there are weeds in our garden. In other words, people can try to dismiss it as, that's not what we really are. He goes, yes, but they are part of our community. We haven't distanced ourselves from them explicitly enough. Something you're saying now, I'm not telling you to agree with me, but something you said right now makes me think that this past week, Itamar Ben-Gvir of Otzma Yehudit, Jewish Power Party in Israel, mentioned that we should be killing 30 to 40 Gazans every single night. Now, I will be down l'chaf zchut, so to speak, that he's talking about Hamas terrorists, and therefore we should try to kill more Hamas terrorists as opposed to abiding by a ceasefire. But even if that is what he meant, which would be a morally okay thing to say, because we're talking about people who are trying to kill Jews, and that is their life mission. They are a modern Amalek. I have no problem saying that. But even if that is what he meant, words have consequences, and not everything, as Rav Soloveitchik said, that you think you should say, and not everything that you say you should write down. And the fact that someone like that would say this publicly, and of course it was widely reported in Arab media, there are consequences to words like that, even if the words can be justified in some level because we're talking about terrorists. Words have consequences, and we have to be very, very, very careful indeed about how we say certain things. And I think Rabbi Lamm, I assume, would agree with me on that.
Yeah, I'm always very hesitant, Scott, to ever say, well, if Rabbi Lamm were living today, he would have said X, Y, Z. I'm always very, very hesitant. But I will say there are times when it's easier to draw the line. It's other times where it's the brunt of the evidence, the force of the weight of gravity is that the situation is similar and that he was so outspoken about a particular issue, Scott, that it's hard to imagine that he wouldn't. You can never prove anything, but the situation and the challenges were not that radically different in 1995. And those obviously are deeply connected to what we've seen over the last number of years in not just the larger community, but, Israeli community or Jewish community or what have you, but also in the religious Zionist community. And quite frankly, he would have been, horrified by the association between the name religious Zionism and, not in this case, but obviously related, and certain kinds of ways of speaking and ways of interacting with others. And to be clear, he was very, very blunt about the need for Jewish self-defense and about the need for Jewish pride and all of these things. That he was uncompromising and very, very firm. And he was not a lefty at all, I think. It's all relative. Some might have called him a lefty today, but there are a lot of people who get called lefties in this environment, right? And even not before an election. So for sure, but I think he, I think it would have been very hard, and he would have been very outspoken today.
Now let's talk about the anti-Semitism. You mentioned a few minutes ago some of the letters he received that were overtly anti-Semitic. What we're seeing now, I don't know how far back in American history you have to go in order to see a comparable form of anti-Semitism, because obviously in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, there was a certain quote unquote acceptable degree of anti-Semitism, meaning acceptable in the sense that that's just what it meant to live in Gullus. And then over the subsequent decades, it seemed to go down to the point that when I was growing up, I didn't really experience any real anti-Semitism of any serious kind. And it seems to have come back with a flourish and with a vengeance. So my question is, what did Rabbi Lamm think about anti-Semitism and how Jews should respond to it? Again, with the caveat you just said, we don't know what he would say because he does not live in 2026. But given what he did experience, do we have any information, any guidance about how he would say a Jewish person should react and relate to anti-Semitism? Is it something he should fight, or something that he should accept and move forward with his own life?
Yeah, no, so that's a great question. He said two things about this, and he spoke about anti-Semitism. I mean, as you say, it was normative earlier on, but it was less normative, through, I would say, I'm not sure exactly, but my guess is that after the Eichmann trial and after 1961, that impacts not only the way that we think about the Holocaust, but the way that everyone started thinking about the Jews, Nostra Aetate around that time, these sorts of developments. And so already not that long into his rabbinic career, he already sees a diminishment of that, level of anti-Semitism. But then post 1973, already you start to see more things coming back. And you see with the United Nations being essentially hijacked, you see with the Arab nations allying themselves also with the USSR, right? And they're promoting a lot of anti-Semitism already certainly already in the 50s, really, but certainly especially 60s, and especially becomes public in the 70s. And Zionism is racism, 1975, I believe. So he's dealing with it. If you look at his sermons, actually, 1973, 1976. A lot of them actually are about anti-Semitism. So it was something that he actually did address. And I would say he had two major messages about it. The first one, and they sort of sound contradictory, but of course they're ultimately not, which is that on the one hand, was not of the mind that we should not be fighting anti-Semitism at all, which is very interesting. That doesn't mean that in 2026, he would have said that the fight is the same and therefore the same thing would apply. But in the 70s, at least, he was very firm on the fact that while there are some people who will be completely inexplicably and implacably Jew haters, and there's nothing that we can really do about them, that there is a generous, relatively open minds, middle ground of people who might have imbibed certain anti-Semitic tropes through, the Western, the air, I guess, over the course of their lives, but they are also receptive to hearing different messages. So he absolutely believed that distinguishing the most virulent and kind of the normies, that the people just kind of normal everyday people in the middle. And he believed it's very important to reach out to them. By the way, he said the same thing about Jews. It's very interesting, Scott. He had, this notion of a left-wing Jewish intellectual is not new today, right? You'll forgive me, Haaretz wasn't founded, in 2023 or what have you. This is, and a lot of the same rhetoric that you hear.
People like Noam Chomsky were active many years ago.
Fair enough. Yeah, that's a good example. Exactly. And you had this, again, among famous Israeli authors and so on and so forth. There's nothing, right? Again, in Koch Hadash Lach Shamesh. And so he He drew a similar distinction there. He said, look, there are some people who are so distant from Israel and from Jewish life. He pointed out as well, they usually went hand in hand, but not always. But in many cases, he said, I don't believe that there's anything constructive to be done in terms of a conversation. And if anything, you're going to be hijacked. You're going to be used to forward a different agenda. I'm not interested in talking to those people, but even some anti-Jewish intellectuals, I believe, are. Yeah, and he was realistic about this. Notice he didn't say, "Oh, yeah, we can reach out to anyone and everyone." No, but he drew that distinction. He drew a parallel distinction with respect to non-Jewish anti-Semitism as well. So that was one message. We cannot fight all of it, but we must fight the battles that can be fought and that can be won. That was number one.
Let me ask about that before you go on, Tzvi. What does it mean to fight that battle? Let me explain what I mean. Because right now, for example, I'm going to throw out two words: genocide and apartheid. Now, I'm going to say those terms have nothing to do with the modern state of Israel or his actions. And they are very easy to throw out there. And that large middle of good-willed people who have no problem with Jews hear these words repeated over and over ad nauseum through social media and regular media. There's a certain point where if you ask an average person who has no particular animus towards Jews, is Israel committing a genocide? That person may say yes. Is Israel an apartheid state? That person may say yes, even though that person isn't an anti-Semitic person. It's just what he's heard over and over, and he doesn't care enough to investigate because, if you hear it over and over, it must be true. So I don't even know how we combat that because I don't even know who believes that at a certain point. And to put a finer point on it, terms, and the reason I use those terms was deliberate, terms like genocide and apartheid say everything in one word or two words or in a bumper sticker. To get the actual reality, it requires more than a bumper sticker or a 1-minute debate. It requires actually a serious engagement with facts and with information. And people don't have time for that. So how do we fight against it?
Yeah, such a great question. Alas, Scott, I don't have an answer for Rabbi Lamm on that. In other words, he was not involved because again, as you say, it was not on the streets in the same way, right? It wasn't, or online in the same way for obvious reasons. But even if there had been an online, it wouldn't have been online necessarily in the same way. So, although it's interesting to ask, actually, maybe it would have social media as it's
right. I was going to say, I'm not so sure that your confidence is correct.
I just don't want to acknowledge
which is the cause and which is the result.
And the answer is, I think the answer is yes. In other words, we all know that in real life and in real history, there are many, many, many causes. And so I think the answer is just yes. What exactly would it look like? Well, that's for prophetic historians to consider. Right. I'll ask. Okay. Anyhow,
so we don't know what he would say.
I don't know. I'll tell you two things I would say, but I don't know if that's what I'm here for. But I'll just once I have a bully pulpit here, so I'll try to make this as ridiculous sounding as possible, Scott, just so to drive even more of the numbers. Well, I would say this for Rabbi Lamm. I don't know what he said about this specifically, but I think he would have agreed and acknowledged that we should educate our own community toward complexity, but we should not assume that we should therefore assume the possibility of complexity from people who are not engaged or educated about these issues in the same way. I think he was very realist about these kinds of things. So yes, complexity, yes, passionate moderation and, et cetera. But in the end, sometimes you do need a simple brand, the Modern Orthodoxy didn't work. Modern Orthodoxy, you need a name, not because it's actually genuinely meaningful, but because it's effective, because it's necessary when dealing with human beings. So I think he would have agreed with that in principle. That I think I can say for him. What I would say is really two things. Number one, I would ask a question that we may never know the answer to, which is what would have happened if Israel would have had a different systematic approach to its media relations and to all these things over the last 75 years. I don't mean even since 2003. I mean, well, we knew that Qatar is sending, is pouring billions of dollars, and we're not going to match their money. And I'm not saying that none of this would have existed. I think what existed, of course, in spades, but would have been exactly the same. Are there things that we could have done? I don't know the answer. I understand many people will say it's a total waste of money, would have been exactly the same. I don't think we'll know the answer to that. But what I can tell you is that I think things could have been different when, before October 7th. And if we've ever had any thought that there's any value to these kinds of proactive strategic plans, I think, I think that those can be extremely effective. And I'll say something else. I'll say there will be a time, I hope, or there may be a time. I'm not a prophet, as we've already said. There may be a time when the current level of anti-Israel animus actually recedes. It may not happen. It may be the genie's out of the bottle, and it will never happen. But in 10 years from now, if there is not, I don't know the future. It could be that it will. It could be it will be worse. It's quite possible it'll be worse, quite frankly. But it's also quite possible that it will simmer down just enough for us to be able to have a little bit more influence on the public discourse so that it's not completely viral in the way that it is today. So my first remark is that we can't change the last 75 years, but we will never know in retrospect whether or not a more robust strategic plan would have been effective. And I think that it's worth seriously considering what that might mean for the future as well. So that's number one. But number two, on the language piece, so I hold here that the best defense is a good offense. In other words, I think it's a terrible mistake to try to meet and re-educate around these terms. I think that is a total failure. You can't combat genocide. You can't, these sorts of things.
As I said in my last podcast, when someone says, explain to me why it's not a genocide, we've already lost.
We've lost. It's over. I agree with you fully. It is done. What you can try to do, it's incredibly hard, but I think what you can try to do is to take the words that are the rallying cry. It's not just genocide, but to take the movement itself of anti-Zionism. And I don't mean Rabbi Lamm's obviously critical love of anti-Zionism, but I mean, things that we would consider to be, horribly problematic, and ultimately, in my opinion, are very often driven by anti-Semitism, beknownst or unbeknownst to whoever's holding that idea, and to stigmatize these terms. In other words, if you can, I think Adam Lewis Klein is right, who's out there, who's it's a story that's worth, I don't agree with those who are following him, whatever it is, but his basic argument is that we need to say that we need to call anti-Zionism a hate movement. Now, I don't necessarily fully agree with every single piece of him, and I actually have major disagreements. But I think that the principle that there are certain movements and rebranding them, there's going on the offensive and being able to describe certain parts of the anti-Zionist movement or what have you as actually being driven by hate, if that's really what you believe. And I'm not arguing those who would say, I don't agree that that's a hate movement. That's not my point right now. But my point is just that if you can stigmatize those terms as actually being against the very values of the West in the 21st century, then you have at least a fighting chance. But as soon as we're fighting on defensive territory, it's over. Some sort of thoughtful, intelligent, effective offensive battle plan, and this is above my pay grade, but I think that is the only path to any success.
Okay, we don't have that much time left, Tzvi, but I want to ask about an important idea. We haven't really talked at all about Torah Umada. And again, we don't know what Rabbi Lamm would say if he were alive in 2026. But one thing which feels very disappointing is for advocates of Torah Umada who believe that Western culture and Western civilization has much to offer, many people, particularly after October 7th, are just so disappointed with what Western civilization has shown us, both in terms of the lack of academic rigor when it comes to things like Jews in Israel, and also in terms of its general hatred towards so many things that we hold dear that don't seem to be coming from an intellectually unbiased perspective. So again, not knowing what he would say, but what do you think Rabbi Lamm's attitude might have been given the way that the academic world in particular has been such a disappointment for so many people who believe in academic rigor and feel that the academy has simply failed in so many ways over the past 3 years?
So two things. The first, it's interesting that for all of his love of Torah Umada and, scholarship and so on and so forth, he was never a big fan of the modern secular academy. Per se. It's interesting, right? In other words, someone who believed in Torah Umada, obviously, but he was obviously, obviously he wasn't out there, promoting, Harvard, Yale, Princeton, etc. He had a job to do. It would have been quite awkward. He did have someone in the family who went to Columbia. He did not course, even his children. One of the kids, three of them went to YU, one of them went to Columbia. That's my mother-in-law. He was completely supportive of her. So, he wasn't, anti. But what he was anti, Scott, is he was very much always very uncomfortable with this kind of like slavish desire for acceptance by America. That whole thing, he was never impressed by. He was never impressed by Americans getting to play basketball. Now we've arrived. It's the golden age of American Jewry. And he would say, wait a second. You read the Torah. Where is playing, it's great to play basketball. That wasn't his issue. But this idea that America has accepted us and now we've arrived, what kind of nebuchal kind of religious, ideology is that? What kind of pathetic, lack of belief in your own standards and your own values and everything that you stand for? Oh, a couple of Americans think we're normal now. And so in melting pot 1950s America, now is the way he would talk to his congregations. Now we've arrived. That's not how we measure success. The same, I think he would have said about the academy as well, right? If it's toxic and it's poisonous, and it didn't, of course, start in 2023, he would have said it's their problem. We have, it's something that's, it's not our job to fix this. We have more, we have our own hashkafat olam. And so I think, number one, I think that this, it kind of 2023, October 7th, I think, frankly, for Rabbi Lamm might have, I don't know, but I'm guessing it might have exposed a kind of a larger mentality spoke out against us where, we're looking for acceptance by the most elite institutions of the West, and that is not any sort of measure of success. It's an opportunity for us to learn and to gain it, but it's not who we are and what we're all about, number one. Number two is, I think that Rabbi Lamm would have also said that Torah, he never said that Torah Umada is about taking whatever the modern academy has to offer. Torah Umada was always about taking the best of culture. If you look around, and there's a lot of junk and a lot of garbage and a lot of lack of critical thinking out there, he would have said, sorry, but that's just not Torah Umada. Torah Umada was never about an institution. Torah Umada was about taking the best of culture, the best of wisdom, and incorporating it as an essential part of our religious personality. And so, even when it comes to the social sciences, never mind the hard sciences and all of that, I know it's been politicized to a degree as well, but, to take that knowledge and to benefit from, I think he would have said, what, can you not read, Shakespeare's a funny example because of Shylock, whatever. But, can you not take, the best resources and read them? You don't need to walk into a modern classroom or to agree with, Western colonialist, settler rhetoric to benefit from the best of worldly wisdom. But he also would have said, yeah, this is yet another reason why you should consider going to YU. If you're in America, Scott. If you're in America,
okay, fine.
Go to YU.
Well, I've got two kids so far. I've gone to Bar Ilan. The third is going this coming year to get her master's. So.
Could have done worse, Scott. Could have done worse.
Now here is a bonus section for members of Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. So Tzvi, let me ask you first, what is the biggest misconception that people have about Rabbi Lamm? To hear the rest of my bonus conversation with Rabbi Sinensky, become a member of Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. We discussed what Tzvi discovered in Rabbi Lamm's enormous personal archive, including a remarkable and often overlooked history of activism on behalf of Soviet Jewry and the B'nai Israel community in India, some exciting plans to make much more of Rabbi Lamm's writing freely available online, and the hundreds of thousands of additional pages of material that are still waiting to be explored. Become a member of Orthodox Conundrum Commentary to hear the entire bonus conversation. You can find the link in the description of this podcast. Tzvi, one of the reasons I really wanted to talk about Rabbi Lamm, aside from the fact that on a personal, selfish level, I've been such an admirer for so long, is less in order to lament what we've lost and more to talk about what we can gain by looking at what he offered. In other words, there are future leaders, a younger generation. Now, they can't obviously emulate his innate intelligence, and they can't necessarily have the natural qualities that he embodied. But there were probably things that he did that were, if not unique, at least unusual and atypical, which helped him become the voice that he represented. So if modern leaders or young people who think about being leaders were to look to Rabbi Lamm as a model, what sorts of ways could he serve as a model for them that they can try to emulate as well? And let me just give you one more sentence about the context of this. I have been saying to anyone who will listen since 2020, when Rabbi Lamm and Rabbi Sachs died, that today it would be so good to have voices like theirs in the world, both to talk to the outside world and to talk to us as Jews, knowing how to deal with this very difficult moment in time. And because of that, we don't have them, but we do have other people who maybe can, in their own way, fill their shoes. So in that way, what would be a way that someone could emulate Rabbi Lamm that's realistic for future leaders to do?
Wow, it's a big one. Um, I'll say as follows. I'll say something perhaps surprising and a little less serious, but serious too, which is he would have said you've got to have a sense of humor. I know that's not the most important thing. I know that that's not necessarily what you were looking for, but I think it's profoundly true. He understood that there are certain absurdities in life that that he was concerned that we didn't learn to be able to not laugh off as a way of dismissing it, but a way of kind of coping with the very, very overbearing and overwhelming pressures of the world. Being a leader, frankly, being a Jew in Israel, especially in 2026, is completely overwhelming. It's just so hard on so many levels, and so our ability to kind of look in the mirror sometimes and to just let off some steam in a healthy way and to not take ourselves too seriously. I think he would have said that I think he might have even said, I wonder sometimes if he would have said that our generation really needs to get a sense of humor. I don't know. I never even heard him say that about his generation, but I don't think he needed to say it about his generation. And he loved a good pun. He loved a good, some of his closest friends had great senses of humor, and he would just exchange puns with them, and so on and so forth. He had a dear friend, Willy Frank, who was a great scientist, tragically died young. He was introduced by Dr. Belkin, then president of Yeshiva University, to Albert Einstein when Einstein came to visit YU. And he was a real prankster, Willy Frank was. And so Einstein extends his hand, and Willy does the same, and out drops a yo-yo. And it's Einstein.
Right.
Yeah, probably. Someone said to me after I told the story, so Einstein actually might have appreciated that, But I think the fact that Rabbi Lamm told this story so many times actually says something about not just Willy Frank, but about Rabbi Lamm as well. So that's number one. But on another note, though, I'd also say that Rabbi Lamm, you can't mimic his intelligence and his particular way of looking at the world and his industry. You can learn from that for sure. He was incredibly disciplined, incredibly so. And that's a piece. But I think the most important thing is that he had guts. He had guts. Rabbi Lamm emerged at a time when, as I said before, Jewish pride was not exactly at an all-time high, and Orthodox pride in particular was not at an all-time high. He's starting his pulpit career in the 1950s. Marshall Sclair and others, famous sociologists, are declaring that in another 50 years, we'll see the demise of American Orthodoxy. This is the beginning of the end. When he got to Springfield, Massachusetts, his second solo pulpit, his first major solo pulpit, someone looked at him and said, "Wait, you're so young. How could you be Orthodox?" And Rabbi Lamm responds, "Well, that orthodoxy is not a geriatric illness." So and he almost single-handedly restored pride by being willing to be bold and outspoken, and not to be afraid to represent in a proud but responsible, as we say, passionate but also moderate fashion. Obviously, there's a passion married to moderation. That's incredibly important. It's just something we've discussed. I don't need to, to go back over that, but that would be a piece as well. But I would say the importance of bold leadership. I think that unfortunately, there are many incentives for our institutional leaders, understandably, to be very parav. If you're a leader on the ground, if you're a grassroots young kind of leader, then you have a lot more opportunity, and perhaps you're tempted to be overly acerbic on social media, and that's one challenge he definitely would have pushed back against. He believed in the Kutzker. He believed in MS. He would have said that building an entire brand around dishonesty, which basically countless social media brands, including major media personalities today, not only the anti-Semitic ones, are built on that brand. It's anathema to him. So on the one hand, the extreme of just saying everything like it is, he would have been deeply uncomfortable with that. But on the other hand, the institutional leaders, I think he would have felt, are being handicapped today by this sense that we can't speak out. And he spoke out and said uncomfortable things to make his congregants feel uncomfortable, not because he wanted to, but because he thought it was best for his community. And that ultimately was how his communities grew. And I think that a lot of our institutional leaders today are understandably, not just pulpit rabbis, but across the board, are scared to do anything but tiptoe on eggshells. And I think he represented something very different. So the ability to marry a bold, honest leadership within institutional life, and at the same time to be moderate and to be wise and to be sagacious when we are not in institutional life, I think he would have asked both of those for our leaders.
And I think that's missing today. So obviously, this idea of passionate moderation, going back to the beginning of our conversation, to be able to be passionate, to be able to be bold, and to say uncomfortable truths is not what people think about when they talk about moderation. People usually think of moderation as a form of being wishy-washy and not really being bold. And that's not what you mean at all. Moderation itself is a form of deep emunah, of deep truth-seeking, because you realize the world is complicated. That doesn't mean you have to therefore take a wishy-washy position whatsoever.
100% with you all the way. And I think that's something, and as I said in a piece on passionate moderation, as you alluded to earlier, we always think of Rabbi Lamm as Torah Umada, and he was, but he talked about Torah Umada about once or twice from the pulpit in his 25 years of rabbinic leadership. But passionate moderation, from the very first writings he has as an undergraduate in the 1940s until his very last writings, until the very end of his life, it's really there throughout.
Okay, well, Rabbi Dr. Tzvi Sinensky, I really appreciate what you brought to the table today, teaching us about your grandfather-in-law and how we can learn from him. And hopefully our future leaders will learn about that passionate moderation and be able to embody it on some level as well. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much. Always a pleasure, Scott.
I'd like to offer a word of thanks to our Patreon supporters. Patreon functions as a voluntary tip jar for Jewish Coffee House and our family of podcasts. Patreon supporters at all levels, as well as paid subscribers to Orthodox Conundrum Commentary, will have access to our upcoming private Q&A sessions. Your support in either place helps sustain thoughtful Jewish conversation. Additional bonus material, including the longer episodes with bonus questions, is available to paid subscribers of Orthodox Conundrum Commentary on Substack. No matter how you choose to support this work, we are deeply grateful. Subscribe to the Orthodox Conundrum podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and please rate it and write a review. I'd appreciate it if you go to Apple Podcasts and rate and review the Orthodox Conundrum. It takes literally 2 minutes. It's just giving a certain number of stars and writing 1 or 2 sentences. Please like the Orthodox Conundrum podcast on Facebook and join our growing Facebook group, the Orthodox Conundrum Discussion Group, where you can feel free to discuss issues in Orthodoxy in an honest and friendly environment. Subscribe to my Substack, Orthodox Conundrum Commentary. Check out the link in the description of this podcast to get your free subscription today. Finally, do you have a message that needs to get out? Do you want to promote your business, your organization, or your cause? The best way is by producing a podcast, and Jewish Coffee House can make it happen. I have experience producing hundreds of podcasts, both for myself and for satisfied clients. Whether you want to learn everything you need in one day, or relax and record and let me do the heavy lifting, Jewish Coffee House Productions will work with you to make it happen and make it even better than you imagined. Let me help you today. Write to us at aliza@jewishcoffeehouse.com. That's ALIZA @jewishcoffeehouse.com. And let's get started with your high-quality, memorable, and effective podcast. I'm Scott Kahn. This has been the Orthodox Conundrum on jewishcoffeehouse.com.